When you talk about Islam and women in the modern Western world, the first thing that often comes to mind is the stereotype of oppression. The image of a woman forced to cover herself, silenced in public life, or living in fear under male authority. These are the narratives that dominate mainstream media, shaping how millions of people interpret an entire religion. But here's the thing: when you actually go deeper, when you actually study the foundational principles of Islam and what it prescribes regarding women, you start to see that much of this so-called oppression isn't coming from the religion itself. It's often cultural baggage, political misuse, or flat-out propaganda designed to paint a distorted picture. The truth is, Islam set out a framework more than 400 years ago that was radically protective of women at a time when women were considered second-class citizens in most societies. Before Islam, many parts of the world, including Arabia, treated women as property, with no voice, no rights, and no dignity. In some cases, female infants were buried alive because they were seen as a burden. Islam flipped that reality upside down. It elevated women to a status of honor and value, made their lives sacred, and gave them protections that were unheard of in other civilizations at the time. But when you look at today's world, especially in the West, you see a strange irony. We talk about freedom, progress, and equality, yet women are constantly exploited by industries built on commodifying their bodies. The entertainment industry, advertising, pornography, fast fashion, all of these systems rely on reducing women to an image, to something consumable, and people are so desensitized to it that they don't even notice. Islam, on the other hand, puts strict boundaries in place specifically to prevent that kind of exploitation. It's not about restricting women, it's about protecting them from being turned into tools of consumerism or objects of desire in a system designed to profit off their image. The hijab, for example, isn't about erasing a woman's identity. It's about forcing society to see her for who she is rather than what she looks like. It's about reclaiming her autonomy from a culture that thrives on sexualizing everything. Now, a lot of people will immediately push back and say, but isn't that restrictive? Isn't it taking away choice? That's the surface level argument. But think about it. In the West, is choice really free when you're living in a culture where the default expectation is that women must constantly look a certain way, dress a certain way, and present themselves in a way that appeals to men? When the pressure to conform to beauty standards is so intense that it causes depression, eating disorders, and self-hatred, is that freedom? Or is it another kind of cage? This is where Islam's perspective hits hard. It doesn't say women have no value unless they meet societal beauty standards. It says women's value exists regardless of what they look like, and it sets up guidelines to make sure that truth isn't lost in the noise of cultural exploitation. It protects women by shifting the focus from their bodies to their minds, their character, and their contribution to society. But here's the kicker: when you start to study this more deeply, you see that the real issue isn't Islam's treatment of women. The real issue is the lens through which the modern world views freedom. We've created a system where women are told they're free to do whatever they want, but in reality, their choices are heavily shaped, almost dictated by industries that profit off their insecurities. Islam simply challenges that system, and that's why it feels so uncomfortable to people who have been raised to see consumer culture as normal. If you look at history, Islamic civilization empowered women in ways that were revolutionary. Women had the right to own property, to inherit wealth, to receive education, and to contribute intellectually and politically. Some of the earliest scholars in Islam were women. They preserved knowledge, narrated traditions, and shaped the spiritual and intellectual foundation of the community. Compare that to Europe in the same era, where women were still struggling to be recognized as legal persons. So, the real question we have to ask is this: who is actually protecting women and who is exploiting them? When Islam sets boundaries, are those chains or are they shields? Because when you strip away the noise, you start to see that what looks like restriction on the outside is often deep protection on the inside. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because once you peel back the surface level arguments, you start realizing that the very criticisms aimed at Islam often expose the flaws of modern Western culture itself. We say women are oppressed in Islam because they cover themselves, but we rarely talk about the fact that women in the West feel pressured to uncover themselves to gain validation. We criticize gender roles in Islam, but we ignore how capitalist systems constantly reinforce other gender expectations, often in ways that harm women more than help them. The point isn't to say one world is perfect and the other is broken. It's to recognize that Islam's system wasn't random. It wasn't designed to diminish women, but to shield them from exactly the kind of exploitation we see dominating the globe today. And the more you understand that, the more the stereotypes fall apart. But this is just the beginning, because once you acknowledge that Islam actually provides a shield against exploitation, you have to go deeper. You have to ask, what specific protections exist? How do these protections function in daily life? And how do they actually translate into a system that keeps women from being turned into commodities? Once you get past the surface level stereotypes and really start examining how Islam lays out its social structure, you realize that it's not random rules, it's an entire framework designed to protect women at every angle. And that framework isn't just spiritual, it's practical, it's legal, it's social. It touches on everything, from how women interact in public, to how their financial rights are preserved, to how their marriages are structured, to how society as a whole is meant to view them. Think about marriage, for example. In most pre-Islamic societies, a woman had no real security when it came to marriage. She could be discarded like property with no compensation and no rights. Islam flipped that dynamic entirely. It made marriage a binding contract that gave women rights, protections, and financial guarantees. The dowry, what's called the mahr, isn't a gift to the family or a transactional exchange. It's given directly to the woman as her own financial security, and no one can take it away from her. It's her personal wealth, untouchable even by her husband. That was groundbreaking for the 7th century, and honestly, it's still groundbreaking today when you think about how many women even now enter marriages without legal or financial safety nets. Then there's inheritance. Before Islam, women had no share in inheritance at all. They were often the ones being inherited. Islam changed that by granting women guaranteed shares in property and wealth. Now, some critics will jump in and say, well, men get more than women, but they ignore the context. In Islam, men are obligated to financially provide for their wives, their children, and even extended family members if needed. Women, on the other hand, are under no obligation to spend a single dime of their money on anyone. What she earns, what she inherits, what she owns, it's hers untouchable. If you look closely, that's not inequality, it's balance. It's a system designed so that women always have financial security without being forced to carry the burden of financial responsibility. Now, let's zoom out to the bigger picture, the public sphere. Islam sets guidelines for how men and women interact, not to restrict, but to preserve dignity and prevent exploitation. Modesty, something that's often misunderstood, isn't just about clothing. It's about conduct, about creating an environment where people are judged based on their character rather than physical appearance. The hijab for women, and modest dress for men too, creates a standard that shifts attention away from objectification. It tells society, value the mind, value the contribution, value the humanity, not just the body. Compare that to modern culture. Walk into any shopping mall, scroll through any social media feed, watch any music video. It's obvious that women's bodies are constantly being leveraged for attention and profit. From Instagram influencers to Super Bowl ads, it's always about selling something through sexuality. Islam, by design, blocks that path. It doesn't allow women or men to be reduced to marketing tools. And when you really think about it, that's a form of liberation, not restriction. Another powerful protection comes from the legal side of Islam. Crimes against women, like harassment, abuse, or exploitation, are treated with severity. In societies before Islam, women often had no recourse. If they were abused, if they were mistreated, there was no system to defend them. Islam introduced strict laws that made harming women a punishable offense. And beyond the legal aspect, it instilled a moral framework that emphasized honor, respect, and responsibility. Prophet Muhammad himself is reported to have said that the best among you are those who are best to their women. That wasn't just a statement, it was a cultural reset. It was a message to men that strength wasn't about dominating women, it was about protecting them, respecting them, and honoring them. What's fascinating is that when you look at the protections Islam offers, they're layered. It's not just about one law here or one ritual there. It's about building a complete environment that minimizes the chances of exploitation. Financial rights prevent economic dependency. Marriage rights prevent emotional exploitation. Social conduct rules prevent sexual objectification. Legal protections prevent abuse. Every angle is covered, like pieces of armor fitting together to create a shield. And here's where it gets really interesting. People will often say, well, we don't need religion for that. Modern laws already protect women. But the reality is, modern laws only react to exploitation. They don't prevent it. Sexual harassment laws, anti-discrimination policies, workplace protections. These are all responses to problems that already exist. Islam, on the other hand, is proactive. It sets boundaries in advance so those problems are less likely to occur in the first place. It doesn't wait until a woman has already been exploited to offer her justice. It structures society to stop that exploitation from happening in the first place. And this is where people often misunderstand the purpose of restrictions in Islam. When you're told not to cross certain lines, it feels like a limitation if you're looking at it from a Western perspective. But in reality, those lines are there as safeguards. They're not walls trapping you in, they're fences keeping danger out. It's like building guardrails on a mountain road. The guardrails don't stop you from driving. They stop you from falling off the cliff. That's why when you look at Islam through the lens of protection, everything starts to make sense. The things that outsiders criticize the most, like the hijab, gender roles, or moral boundaries, are actually the very mechanisms that shield women from the exploitation that dominates the global landscape today. But here's the kicker: protection is only one half of the story, the other half is empowerment. Because while Islam shields women from harm, it also equips them with rights, responsibilities, and opportunities that give them power in society. And if you want to understand the real strength of this system, You have to see how Islam doesn't just protect women, it empowers them to thrive. When people talk about empowerment in today's world, the word often gets twisted into something superficial. Empowerment is marketed as the freedom to wear whatever you want, post whatever you want, and sell yourself however you want. But when you look deeper, you start to see that much of what passes for empowerment today is just another form of exploitation dressed up in the language of freedom. Corporations and industries have realized that if they frame sexualization as choice, women will willingly participate in their own commodification, and companies will profit massively from it. Think about the multi-billion dollar beauty and fashion industries. They thrive on convincing women that they are never enough, never pretty enough, never skinny enough, never youthful enough. And every solution they sell, whether it's makeup, surgery, or clothing, comes with the hidden message: you are not valuable unless you meet this standard. That's not empowerment. That's manipulation. Pornography is another example. It's sold as sexual liberation, but in reality, it's one of the biggest engines of female exploitation in human history. It normalizes abuse, rewires men's brains to objectify women, and leaves women used, discarded, and often deeply traumatized. But society doesn't talk about that side. It calls it freedom. Now, here's where Islam completely flips the script. Empowerment in Islam isn't about how much of your body you can show or how loudly you can conform to consumer culture. It's about removing yourself from those systems entirely. It's about grounding your value in something untouchable: your soul, your mind, your dignity. And when you're grounded in those things, no amount of advertising, no amount of objectification, no amount of cultural pressure can diminish your worth. That's real empowerment. Look at history. Some of the earliest Muslim women weren't just passive figures in the background. They were scholars, entrepreneurs, warriors, and community leaders. Khadija, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, was a wealthy businesswoman who ran her own trade empire at a time when women were rarely allowed into those spaces. Aisha, another wife of the Prophet, became one of the most important scholars in Islamic history. Thousands of narrations about the Prophet's teachings come through her, and scholars, men and women, studied under her guidance. These weren't exceptions. Islamic civilization produced countless women who were doctors, educators, and thought leaders. They didn't need to sell themselves to be valued. They didn't need to play into a system of sexual exploitation to gain influence. Their power came from their knowledge, their character, and their contribution. That's empowerment power rooted in something lasting, not something disposable. Contrast that with today's empowerment models. A woman can become famous overnight through social media, but her fame is often directly tied to how much she reveals, how she looks, or how much attention she can attract from men. It's temporary power built on fragile foundations, and it collapses as soon as youth fades or the algorithm moves on. Islam offers a different model: power that doesn't expire with age, beauty, or trend cycles. And here's the kicker: when women step into that Islamic framework of empowerment, they become unshakable. A woman who knows her worth doesn't need to chase validation through likes, comments, or superficial approval. She doesn't need to fit into the mold that society sets for her, because she's already grounded in a system that values her beyond the surface. That's freedom, not the freedom to conform to a new kind of slavery, but the freedom to transcend it. Now, critics will say, but isn't Islam limiting opportunities for women? And that's where context matters. Islam doesn't deny women education, work, or influence. It just places boundaries that ensure their dignity is never compromised in the process. A Muslim woman can be a doctor, a scientist, an entrepreneur, a leader, whatever she chooses without being reduced to her physical appeal. That's an environment where real achievement speaks louder than appearance. It's worth asking which model of empowerment actually serves women better, the one that tells them they're free to do whatever they want, as long as they constantly conform to toxic beauty standards, sexualize themselves for attention, and play into industries that exploit them, or the one that shields them from those pressures, gives them financial rights, legal protections, and social dignity, and allows them to build influence based on substance instead of superficiality. Here's another layer people often overlook. Empowerment in Islam isn't just individual, it's collective. It doesn't just empower women to protect themselves, it empowers communities to value and defend women. Men are commanded to respect women, to lower their gaze, to treat them as sisters, mothers, and daughters. Society is built around safeguarding them, not exploiting them. And when men fail at that responsibility, it's considered a moral failing, not a cultural norm. Compare that to the modern world where catcalling, harassment, and exploitation are shrugged off as just how things are. Empowerment in Islam is also tied to responsibility. Women aren't just given rights, they're trusted with responsibilities that shape entire communities. Raising children, educating families, preserving knowledge. These aren't small things. These are the foundations of civilization. And by elevating women in those roles, Islam acknowledges their indispensable value. So, when we talk about empowerment, we have to be careful not to confuse the loud noise of consumer culture with actual freedom. Real empowerment is quiet, steady, and unshakable. It's rooted in dignity. And when you study Islam's system, you see that it gives women a form of empowerment that can't be bought, sold, or manipulated. But here's the thing, protection and empowerment are powerful on their own, but Islam doesn't stop there. It goes further by building an entire moral and social system designed to preserve family structure, community well-being, and intergenerational strength. Because women aren't just individuals, they are the backbone of families, and families are the backbone of civilization. And that's where the conversation has to go next, how Islam safeguards the family unit, and why that's the ultimate protection against exploitation in society. If you want to understand how Islam protects women from exploitation, you can't just stop at individual rights and personal empowerment. You have to zoom out and look at the bigger structure that Islam is constantly trying to preserve, the family. Because Islam doesn't view women as isolated units in society, it views them as essential pillars in the foundation of family life. And when the family is strong, women are strong. When the family is protected, women are protected. Now think about the modern world. One of the most obvious patterns in the last 50 years is the deliberate breakdown of the family unit. Divorce rates are skyrocketing, single-parent households are rising. Casual relationships have replaced long-term commitments, and entire generations are growing up disconnected from stable homes. And who bears the heaviest burden of this collapse? Women, single mothers struggling to raise kids alone. Women abandoned after being used in short-term relationships. Women pressured to do it all without any structural support. It's a system that creates enormous emotional, physical, and financial strain, and it's sold to us as progress. Islam recognized long ago that when you weaken the family, you expose women to exploitation at every level. So it built an entire framework to safeguard the family unit. Marriage in Islam isn't just a romantic contract, it's a social covenant, a bond that comes with rights and responsibilities for both partners. Men are obligated to provide, protect, and honor their wives. Women are given rights to financial security, respect, and care. Divorce exists, but it's treated as a last resort, not a casual option. And the rights of children are woven into the fabric of that relationship, ensuring that the next generation isn't left unprotected. This isn't about idealizing the past. It's about recognizing that Islam puts guardrails around family life in a way that shields women from being left vulnerable. The dowry, the legal obligations, the emphasis on respect, all of these are structural reinforcements that keep women from being discarded or devalued. Contrast that with modern dating culture, where women can invest years of their lives into relationships, only to be left behind with nothing when a man decides to move on. Another important point is how Islam handles sexuality. In the modern world, sexuality is everywhere: advertising, entertainment, social media. Women are constantly pressured to perform sexually, to display themselves, to compete with unrealistic standards. And the fallout of this hyper-sexualized culture is devastating. Broken families, fatherless children, casual exploitation, and emotional scars that last a lifetime. Islam takes a radically different approach. It confines sexual intimacy to the secure, committed environment of marriage. It doesn't allow sexuality to become a tool for profit or manipulation. It doesn't let it become a weapon used against women. Instead, it makes it sacred, private, and mutually respectful, that protects women not just from exploitation, but from the emotional chaos of a culture that has turned intimacy into entertainment. Now, think about parenting. In Islam, motherhood is given immense honor. The Prophet Muhammad described mothers as being 3 times more deserving of respect than fathers. That's not just symbolic, it's a recognition of the enormous role women play in shaping future generations. In a world that often undervalues stay-at-home mothers or frames motherhood as a burden, Islam elevates it as one of the most honorable roles a human can hold. And by doing so, it protects women from the cultural narrative that their worth disappears if they're not constantly producing for the economy or performing for society. But Islam doesn't stop at praising mothers. It structures the entire family system to support them. Financial responsibility is placed squarely on the man, so a woman isn't forced to sacrifice motherhood to survive. Extended family systems are encouraged, so women aren't left to raise children entirely on their own. Even laws of inheritance and guardianship are designed to ensure that women and children are always provided for, even in cases of death or separation. This is not weakness, it's strength. It's a system that builds a fortress around the most vulnerable, ensuring they are never abandoned to face exploitation alone. And here's where it gets real: when the family unit is strong, exploitation has no foothold. Women aren't forced into industries that commodify them just to survive. Children aren't left vulnerable to cycles of poverty and abuse. Men are held accountable for their responsibilities, and society as a whole becomes less predatory. The family is the first line of defense against a system that profits from brokenness. Now, look at the world today. What happens when the family collapses? Corporations win, governments gain more control. Industries like pornography, alcohol, and pharmaceuticals thrive because broken families create broken people, and broken people are easier to manipulate and exploit. When you weaken family bonds, you weaken women, you weaken children, and you weaken society as a whole. Islam saw this 400 years ago and built its entire social structure to prevent it. And this isn't just about protecting women from external exploitation. It's about protecting them internally too. A woman who knows she has the unwavering support of her family, who knows she is valued as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, and as a sister, isn't easily manipulated by cultural pressures. She doesn't need the validation of strangers. She doesn't need to compete in toxic beauty hierarchies. Her sense of worth is anchored in a secure, stable environment. But here's the interesting part. Critics often point to family roles in Islam as evidence of oppression. They say, well, women are confined to certain roles and men are given authority. But what they miss is that Islam balances rights with responsibilities. Authority in Islam isn't dominance, it's accountability. A man isn't just given the role of protector, he's burdened with it. He has to provide, he has to sacrifice, he has to lead with justice. And if he fails, he is held accountable before God. That's not privilege. That's responsibility. So when you strip away the noise, you start to see the brilliance of this system. Islam doesn't just protect women individually, it protects them by fortifying the family. It builds a fortress around them that shields them from exploitation both inside and outside the home. And in a world that's increasingly tearing families apart, that fortress is more valuable than ever. But there's still one more layer to this, because Islam's protection of women isn't just about individual rights, empowerment, or family. It's also about society as a whole. It creates a moral environment where exploitation is minimized not just at home, but in the entire culture. And that's what we'll dive into next, how Islam's moral vision creates a shield around women at the societal level, making exploitation not just rare, but unacceptable. When you pull back from the individual and the family and you look at the bigger picture, you realize that Islam doesn't just build protection in private, it builds an entire culture around safeguarding women. Because at the end of the day, no matter how empowered a woman is individually, or how strong her family might be, if the society around her is predatory, toxic, and exploitative, she will still be exposed. Islam understood this reality and created a system where society itself becomes a shield, where exploitation is minimized not just by law, but by culture, values, and collective responsibility. Start with modesty. This isn't just about clothing, it's about atmosphere. Islam doesn't want a sexualized environment where women are constantly on display and judged for their bodies. It builds a cultural ethic where both men and women are expected to lower their gaze, to respect each other, and to avoid treating one another as objects. When that ethic becomes the norm, women don't have to carry the entire burden of protection themselves. The culture does some of the heavy lifting. That's a huge difference from today's world, where women are told to dress however they want, but then left to face harassment, objectification, and exploitation in an environment that encourages men to see them as consumable. Then there's accountability. Islam doesn't just say be good and hope for the best. It creates laws and moral codes that enforce respect. Adultery, exploitation, and abuse aren't shrugged off as mistakes. They're serious violations with consequences. That doesn't just protect women legally, it creates a culture where men think twice before harming women because the social and spiritual cost is heavy. And beyond the law, there's the moral teaching that every man will be accountable to God for how he treated the women in his life. That accountability goes deeper than any courtroom. It reaches into the conscience. Another key element is community. Islam doesn't leave women isolated or forced to fend for themselves. It creates a collective responsibility where society is meant to look out for its most vulnerable. In the early Muslim community, widows and single mothers weren't left to struggle alone. They were supported financially, emotionally, and socially. Zakat, the mandatory charity system, ensured that wealth circulated and that no woman was left without support. Compare that to today's world, where women often fall through the cracks, left to depend on exploitative industries or government systems that reduce them to statistics. Islam makes support a moral duty, not a charity option, and here's where it gets fascinating. By building a moral environment, Islam makes certain types of exploitation socially unacceptable. In modern culture, pornography is normalized. Strip clubs, OnlyFans, escort services. All of these are treated as just another business. In Islam, these industries can't exist. They're not just illegal, they're immoral. The culture doesn't tolerate them, and that's intentional. Because once you normalize industries built on objectification, exploitation spreads like wildfire. Islam shuts the door before it even opens, but Islam's societal shield doesn't just prevent harm, it elevates respect. Women are referred to as daughters, sisters, mothers, and wives in ways that carry dignity. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized that men should treat women with kindness, honor, and fairness. And those values weren't abstract, they were lived out in daily life. Women taught, led, and influenced society while still being respected for their modesty and dignity. That's a balance that the modern world struggles to find. Now, let's be real. No society, Muslim or otherwise, lives up to its ideals perfectly. There are countries today that claim Islam but mistreat women. But that's not because of Islam. It's because of human failure, corruption, and cultural baggage that strays from the original teachings. If you judge Islam by its principles, not by its misapplications, you see a system that is not only protective but revolutionary in its ability to shield women from being turned into commodities. And that brings us to the bigger question: why is this message so controversial today? Why is it that when Islam sets boundaries, the world screams oppression? But when industries exploit women for billions of dollars, the world calls it empowerment. The answer is simple: profit. Exploitation is profitable. A woman who is insecure, objectified, and trapped in toxic cycles is easier to sell to, easier to manipulate, and easier to control. Islam threatens that system by creating women who are secure, dignified, and shielded from manipulation. And that's why it's so heavily attacked in the media. But here's the truth: as the world continues down this path of hyper-sexualization, broken families, and consumer-driven exploitation, more and more people are waking up to the reality that something isn't working. Depression, loneliness, exploitation, abuse, these aren't signs of freedom, they're signs of collapse. And when people start searching for alternatives, Islam's model stands out not as a relic of the past, but as a solution for the future. So, when we talk about how Islam truly protects women from exploitation, we're not just talking about a set of religious rules. We're talking about an entire system, one that protects women individually, empowers them personally, fortifies them within family, and shields them in society. It's holistic, it's comprehensive, and it's timeless. And maybe that's the real message here, that Islam's treatment of women isn't about chains or cages. It's about shields and safeguards. It's about building a world where women don't have to sell themselves to be valued, where they don't have to fear abandonment or exploitation, where they don't have to live in a culture that profits off their pain. It's about creating a society that sees them, honors them, and protects them not because they're weak, but because they're invaluable. That's a message the modern world desperately needs. And it's a message that Islam has been delivering for more than 400 years.